The girl disappeared from her home under strange circumstances. It looked like she just left of her own accord. But during the investigation, very disturbing facts were discovered. For several years, her fate remained unknown until detectives finally got to the bottom of the truth. However, this turned out to be only the beginning of a much more terrible story. Heather Church was born on July 7, 1978 in the small American town of Black Forest, Colorado. Over time, her parents had 3 sons, and the girl helped take care of them from an early age. She was an active and cheerful child, had many friends and loved spending time with them. Heather also enjoyed playing the violin and was an excellent student at school. When the girl was 13, her parents decided to divorce. She suffered the divorce quite painfully, but continued to communicate regularly with her father. After the divorce, she had to devote even more time to caring for her younger brothers. On September 17, 1991, she stayed at home to look after the youngest of them, who was 5 years old. Meanwhile, her mother had taken her 2 other children to a Boy Scout activity and was expected to return that evening. While the mother was waiting for her sons, she decided to call home to check if everything was okay. Heather said she and her brother were watching TV. Despite the fact that it was already time for the child to sleep, the mother allowed them to finish watching the program and asked her daughter to put her brother to bed immediately after that. She also said that she would be back around 10 o'clock. Arriving home at approximately 10:15, the woman immediately noticed that the lights were turned off in almost all the rooms. This struck her as a little odd, as she doubted Heather had gone to bed before she returned. Approaching the door, she discovered that it was not locked. The mother thought that Heather might have let the cat outside for a walk and forgot to lock the door. Inside, the woman noticed a slight disorder, which was completely atypical. There was always complete order and cleanliness in their house. The children did not throw their things around and constantly cleaned up after themselves. But this time everything was different. For example, a chair in the kitchen was overturned and had its back resting on the kitchen table, and several other items were out of place. The woman went into the room of her youngest son. He was sleeping in his bed. Then she went to Heather's room, but the girl was not there. Considering that it was already late evening and she needed to look after her brother, the girl clearly could not go anywhere. The mother looked all over the house, but could not find her. She called several of Heather's friends and their parents, but none of them saw the girl that day. The woman also walked around the area around the house, but the girl was nowhere to be found. After this, she decided to contact the police. In addition, she called her ex-husband, and he immediately went to the house. At that time, all the family's friends knew about the girl's disappearance, and they also decided to come. While some were in the house with their mother, others went to explore the streets in the cars. Their house was located in a remote area, so the surroundings mainly consisted of fields, country roads and sparse forests. Considering that it was already dark outside, inspecting this area was problematic. When police arrived at the scene, several family friends and their neighbors were already in the house. Investigators spoke with the mother, took a photo of the girl and wrote down her characteristics. At first the woman said that her daughter was wearing a blouse, but later she found it among her things in the house. The mother looked through them all and said that the only thing missing from her daughter's closet was a T-shirt with a Mickey Mouse on it. Her youngest son, with whom Heather was babysitting that evening, also did not know where his sister had disappeared to. She put the boy to bed, and he woke up only after his mother returned. The police began searching for the girl only the next morning. They organized a search operation within a radius of several kilometers from their home, and also interviewed most of the neighbors. Meanwhile, forensic scientists examined the house for any evidence. The fact that there were a large number of people in the room on the evening of the disappearance made their work very difficult. As a result, they were never able to find a single clue. At one point, the girl's mother decided to vacuum the carpet in one of the rooms, but detectives immediately stopped her. They said that in this way the woman could spoil possible evidence. And then she remembered something else. While her mother was searching throughout the house for Heather, she noticed something strange. The mosquito net on one of the windows was installed the wrong way around. The woman didn't think much of it that evening, but it became a potential lead for detectives. Experts examined the window and found several fingerprints on the mosquito net frame. They were compared with the prints of all family members and those people who came to their house that evening. Forensic scientists did not find a single match. If up to this point the investigators still assumed that Heather could have left the house of her own free will, then after the discovery of the prints, the version of the abduction came to the fore. According to the police, someone could have entered the home through that same window and then exited through the front door with the girl. Detectives called dog handlers, and search dogs picked up the girl's scent. But here the investigators were waiting for something unusual. They assumed that the kidnapper took Heather out of the house and put him in his car, after which he drove off. However, the dogs actually refuted this version. They smelled the girl from the door to the road and further to a small pond. Before this, the police had already inspected the reservoir and found nothing there. After the dogs led to him, experts carefully examined the pond, but again they were unable to find a single clue. Over the next few days, detectives received a number of distant tips, but they all led to a dead end. For example, they were notified of a suspicious vehicle that had been following a school bus, as well as a vehicle that had stopped several times near a local school. Investigators followed up on all of these tips and were unable to find any connection to Heather's disappearance. The first serious suspect in this case was her father, Michael. His ex-wife told police that he was sometimes quite harsh with the children and would even hit them for some offense. At the same time, the woman believed that despite his hot temperament, he sincerely loved his children, and they were all on good terms with their father. The detectives decided to talk to him, and Michael provided them with an alibi for the evening of the disappearance. After work, he visited the gym, went to a local church, and then headed to his apartment. There he called a friend, and their conversation continued until his ex-wife informed him about the disappearance of his daughter. The police checked this alibi and were convinced of its reliability, after which they stopped considering the father as a suspect. For several days since the disappearance, investigators were unable to find a single serious lead. They continued the search, joined by hundreds of volunteers. People combed the streets, fields and forests, but it led to nothing. All they were able to find was a wristwatch and some bills on the ground. But no connection with Heather's disappearance was established. On the fourth day, helicopters joined the search, but with their help they did not find any leads. Friends of the family and other concerned people distributed more than 10,000 leaflets in large populated areas, and the girl's parents appeared on local television asking for the return of the daughter. One of their wealthy acquaintances even offered a reward of $10,000 for any information about the missing girl, but this did not bring any significant results. Police were also trying to find a match to the fingerprints found on the window. They entered them into the national database, but failure awaited them here too. Since then, detectives have received a number of other tips, but they all led to a dead end. As a result, the case stalled for several years until a sudden breakthrough occurred on September 16, 1993. The traveler was walking through the forest about 50 kilometers from Heather's house. At some point, he noticed skull bones on the ground that turned out to be human. The man reported his discovery to the police, and they quickly determined that they could belong to a female child. They collected suitable missing persons cases in the area and quickly got to the abduction of Heather Church. After checking the girl's skull and dental records, experts obtained a complete match. Upon closer examination, they determined that the girl died from a blow to the head with a blunt object. The police examined the place where the bones were found and found two children's pajamas there, photographs of which were shown to Heather's mother. But the woman said the clothes did not belong to her daughter. Thus, investigators began to suspect that the person responsible for the girl's murder may be involved in other crimes. However, this discovery did not bring detectives any closer to catching the culprit. Now they were only sure that the girl was dead. However, there was no new evidence in front of them. As a result, the case stalled again for another 2 years. In 1995, the police department changed its sheriff. While reviewing old unsolved cases, he decided to focus on the murder of Heather Church and assigned one of the most experienced detectives in the area to the case. The first thing he noticed was that the previous team of investigators had only entered the possible killer's fingerprints into the state database and the FBI's general database. However, there was one nuance: each state had its own base, which did not overlap with the others. In the United States, as well as in Canada, with which they had close ties, there were 92 fingerprint databases. And the detective decided to send a sample from the Church's house to each of them. He sent out the prints and waited. 10 days later, the long-awaited breakthrough happened. A colleague called him and told him about a complete coincidence. The prints belonged to 43-year-old Robert Brown. This name has long been familiar to the law enforcement systems of several states. He has been prosecuted multiple times for auto theft and theft in California and Louisiana. Detectives immediately decided to check where he was living at the time of Heather's murder. The answer to this question was not long in coming. In those days and until now, the man lived only 800 meters from the Church's house. Moreover, he was their closest neighbor, since the houses in that area were located at a decent distance from each other. This turn of events shocked the detectives. They were looking for the criminal all over America and even Canada, and all this time he was literally under their noses. On March 28, police organized surveillance of his home. They feared the man might barricade himself inside, open fire or destroy potential evidence. After some time, he left the house and went to the city for shopping, where he was arrested. It is noteworthy that during the arrest he behaved very calmly. During interrogation, Brown also showed no signs of fear. He calmly answered detectives' questions and denied that he had ever been in Church's house. The man also stated that he did not kill anyone. Meanwhile, investigators searched his house, where several interesting finds awaited them. A lot of firearms were found there, as well as several items of children's clothing. In addition, the house had a lot of women's jewelry and other items, which, as it turned out later, belonged to the residents of Black Forest. It turned out that Brown had been robbing his neighbors for several years and remained out of sight of the police all this time. Detectives studied his biography and found several interesting points there. Robert grew up in a large family, dropped out of school shortly before graduation and joined the army. He served there for more than 6 years, with several tours to Vietnam and South Korea. In 1976, he was dishonorably discharged for using illegal substances, after which he worked in different states in low-key jobs. The man was married 5 times, and the marriage always ended in divorce. Detectives contacted his ex-wives and heard the same story from them. Brown was extremely short-tempered and aggressive. Any little thing could piss him off so much that the women seriously feared for their lives. For this reason, they all filed for divorce within a short time after the wedding. The longer the detectives dug into his biography, the more creepy facts surfaced. While Brown was living in Louisiana, his neighbor was found murdered in her apartment. A similar situation occurred in another state while the man was living there. His other neighbor disappeared without a trace under mysterious circumstances. At this point, investigators began to suspect that they were facing a real serial maniac. Meanwhile, Brown was charged with Heather's murder and was in jail awaiting trial. Despite the fact that his fingerprints were found in Shehe's house, investigators seriously feared that the man could escape punishment for murder. His defense could have made it seem as if Brown had simply broken into the house to commit a robbery, given that no evidence directly linked him to the murder. This version could well work in a jury trial. However, on May 24, his lawyer made an unexpected statement. Brown agreed to confess to Heather's murder if the prosecutor refused the death penalty. Considering all of the above, the prosecution quickly accepted this offer, and the man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The terms of the deal meant that he would plead guilty to murder, but did not oblige the man to give any testimony. For this reason, the girl's family and investigators never learned how the events of that evening unfolded. According to detectives, Brown decided to rob their house, but did not expect to meet Heather there. He got inside through the window, noticed the girl and struck her with an unknown object, causing her death. The man could then carry her body out the front door and later dispose of it in the woods. But for detectives this was just the beginning. Given Brown's background and the suspicious deaths of his neighbors, they continued to look for the man's connection to other murders. It was very difficult to do this, since there was no evidence against him. But a few years later, the detectives received unexpected help. Brown himself began writing them letters from prison. The first one was sent on March 17, 2000. At first, detectives thought it was some kind of joke. The man wrote in riddles and meaningless sentences, but they soon found a possible hidden meaning in all this. Brown wrote that detectives missed 7 golden opportunities and they thought they were talking about other unsolved murders. Then one of the researchers himself wrote a letter to the criminal and soon received a response. The new message also consisted of vague language. Brown wrote that detectives earned only 1 point, while he had 48. Investigators were shocked, because they were obviously talking about murders that Robert could have committed. In addition to the letter, he drew a map showing 9 states and 48 points. Investigators admitted that in this way Brown pointed them to the places where he killed other people. The problem was that it was simply impossible to find these victims based on the drawing. But the man continued to write letters to them, giving more and more hints. In some cases, he even told them the specific cities where he committed his crimes, and detectives actually discovered unsolved murders there. All this went on for several years. Researchers have compiled a rough list of his possible victims. In 9 cases, they were almost 100% sure that Brown was behind the murder. However, they were unable to find a single piece of evidence. The letters also could not act as evidence of his guilt, since all the wording was vague and did not contain any specifics. Investigators struggled to prove at least one murder to ensure that Brown would not be released. Despite the fact that the conditions of his imprisonment excluded the possibility of early release, the criminal still had room for maneuver. His lawyers could appeal. If the court approves it, the man could well be released, but a second sentence for murder excluded such a possibility. Digging through all of Brown's letters, detectives zeroed in on one possible victim in Colorado Springs. Of course, the perpetrator did not reveal her name, so investigators had no idea who she was. However, Robert wrote that this happened in 1987, and the detectives decided to approach the investigation from a different angle. They didn't find any suitable murders, but instead began looking into reports of car thefts. Considering Brown has been accused of similar crimes multiple times, this could lead him to a much-needed lead. Investigators selected a number of similar statements, one of which eventually caught their attention. The man reported the car stolen, but a few days later it was found in the store parking lot. After going deeper into the store, the detectives learned that that same year Robert worked there as a cashier. They immediately went to this man and asked him the main question: did any of his relatives and friends disappear in '87? To the detectives' surprise, it paid off. A man whose car was stolen said his wife disappeared with him. Her remains were never found, so the case was not treated as a murder. The police assumed that she simply ran away from her husband. This girl's name was Rossi Spelli. She was only 15 years old at the time of her disappearance. Despite such a young age, the laws of the state of Colorado in those years allowed her to get married. She got married a few months before her disappearance, which occurred on November 10, 1987. Detectives were sure that this was the victim Brown was writing about, but again they did not have a single piece of evidence. Then, in 2006, they decided to come to his prison and try to get more information. Hearing that the investigators managed to solve this mystery, the criminal was impressed. The detectives asked him leading questions. Unexpectedly for them, he directly admitted to the murder. Brown said he lured the victim to his apartment, killed him and later disposed of the body. In July 2006, he officially confessed to the murder of Rossi Spelli, for which he received another life sentence. Thus, the detectives achieved the goal and practically excluded the possibility of his release. However, none of them doubted that Robert Brown was involved in dozens of other murders, but the man himself did not give additional confessions, so no charges were filed for other murders. Detectives never fully understood why he confessed to 2 murders when his chances in court were far from zero. He apparently took some pleasure in having his terrible deeds talked about and written about throughout the country. Robert is still in prison to this day. He is currently 69 years old. Perhaps detectives will sooner or later be able to link him to other murders. If he really has 48 victims, he could be one of the world's most prolific serial killers. But detectives do not rule out that he simply made up some of them to attract attention. Heather's mom thanked investigators for their many years of work, which made it possible to put a dangerous criminal behind bars for the rest of his life. Although the pain of losing her daughter never left her entire family, she felt some relief from the fact that her killer would no longer be able to harm anyone. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thank you for watching.